Howdy, 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 everybody. We're back. Oof. We're shaving for another scoop episode. Tonight is going to be a weird one because we're going to be talking about an episode that is probably one of the arguably least desired, kind of the most under-designed episodes of the entire show. This episode follows the town episode that we talked about last time, where Scoop and Biscuit kind of find themselves, again, since wandering from the chess maze, the hedge maze episode, where they get caught in the ASMR nighttime sphinxes mirage trap. They kind of come wandering out of that in a stupor and find themselves in the town, which is this hyper urban city, and traverse through a space of otherness, of blackness, of whiteness, of richness, of poorness, and kind of just otherness in particular. And there's a really big kind of extremely hyper modern sentiment that's really expressed throughout that town episode. And they leave that episode wandering kind of out through, they basically like punch through the edge. They kind of come through one side of the town, and they kind of come walking in through that one side of the town and walk out through the other side of the town, where they then begin to kind of wander through. And again, we're going to talk about, even in live kind of off the top conversation, about the design of this episode, because even I are missing a pretty big significant chunks of what this episode looks like. There's 2 or 3 directions that are relatively explicitly laid out that I kind of can follow, but what we exactly do with them is kind of up in the air still. And so it might be kind of interesting to talk about here. So Scoop and Biscuit have just made their way out of the town, out of this super city, out of this big hyper modern area, and as well a necessary extension of, again, a labyrinth, one of the kind of most blatantly visible labyrinths following the hedge maze labyrinth. And it looks all of a sudden now, several of these episodes have been just like back to back to back labyrinths. I even talked about it maybe briefly on the last recap stream that we did a little while ago, and I'll probably put that up there on YouTube as well. I'll just have to download and figure it out. But one of the alternate titles for this show, I think, is Beautiful Labyrinths. I think if we have to run into issues with the Scoop Universe titling for this show, that might be one of the ways that we go down it, because I think it's really clean and funky and interesting, and it has that midnight gospel vibe to it that I kind of want to continue to allude to in some constructional ways. Brief aside, literally just today, not even like an hour ago or something like that, maybe 2 hours ago, we supposedly successfully applied to get a copyright for Scoop Universe, which could be a huge deal. That's honestly really awesome and really exciting. It's one of the things that a lot of, when you look up kind of like videos and tips and articles and commentary from executives or people who have pitched shows a lot or constantly are receiving on the receiving end of these pitches, one of the things that they look for, or at least some people look for, is do you have yours? Is it copywritten? Like, do you have proof that this is yours, that you're serious about it, that no one else has it, and that we can run with this like right now? And so hopefully if that works out, then we'll actually be able to have some protection over the title itself. Because again, there is a YouTube channel that is kind of referred to as Scoop Universe that I had no prior awareness of before naming my show. It was only coming up. I Googled my own show, Googled my own idea, and realized that for some reason that this had already been a thing. Completely unrelated, dealing with Steven Universe, which I guess in a way we allude to Steven Universe things as well. But anyways, some exciting news as a brief aside. So today we're going to be talking about Springa, or the Dreamy Neighborhood episode that follows the town episode. We saw the kind of spin down or spin up, depending on which way you look at it, we go from the hedge maze, which is just, again, like green, explicitly mazed, explicitly labyrinthine, and going that suddenly those green walls converted into concrete, and you find ourselves in the concrete jungle, the very, very like matter-of-fact distillation of that rat race, of that maze hunt, of people that are trapped in it, attempting to kind of make their way through it, create communities inside it. And in this kind of funky evolutionary niche ecosystem way, we saw characters that literally, like creatures, like animals, have kind of begun to establish themselves in the town and create the narratives in that way. The town then kind of devolves or evolves from that onto the other side into another world of Scoop Universe. And this is something like the connection between these worlds is something that still has to be kind of determined. Is the Dreamy Neighborhood a completely different world? Is it another section of the town world? Because again, Scoop and Biscuit kind of find themselves teleported into this other place. Are these two different worlds? Do they even know if these are on two different worlds? Is it just one world where half of it has kind of like beyond the town, beyond the edge of the town, you find that there are the suburbs, essentially. And that is what this town evolves into, the Dreamy Neighborhood, that as the city kind of fades away, Scoop and Biscuit continue walking forward, and there is, I believe, placed here now two different characters that have some kind of connection. One extremely old character that was one of the very first characters that was actually designed in Scoop Universe, whose name, if we find it down here, is Ha 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 Ha. A Courage the Cowardly Dog animated kind of... He's kind of like a lower middle class white border town rundown middle like midwesty vibed kind of like bar villain of sorts. He's kind of like this like scumbaggy guy that is certainly, he is villainous, like on the scale of good or villainous. He's on the kind of villainous chaotic scale, but he kind of exists as one of these characters, these spoken characters on the outside, kind of like lanky douchebaggy, almost like drug adjacent characters that is on the outskirts of the town and the Dreamy Neighborhood. There's this kind of space between where they move through the almost like the poor section of the town that is almost so poor that it's outside of the town. Scoop and Biscuit have to make their way through that and onto the Dreamy Neighborhood itself. So there's this kind of transition from the town through the city, through the kind of the poorer sections on the outside of the city, where it almost devolves into truly like now a town, like a village-esque almost style. And then beyond that, there is the Dreamy Neighborhood itself. There's another character that is alongside Ha 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 Ha, who might be explicitly seen in another episode, or at least a character related to her, who at the moment is named Ariadne, but we will see her later, or we will at least see potentially who would be her mom later or grandma later, but more on that actually in several episodes from now, in one of the flashback episodes. But so we're going to see Ha 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 interacting very briefly, almost like Easter egg style, off to the side with this Ariadne character. And again, if you're familiar with some Greek lore and labyrinth lore, some of that might sound familiar to you. And as a mix-up of two different other Greek characters. But so they would just kind of pass through this almost like spooky forest part of the town with these kind of like wooden ramshackle houses. And we see these two characters there briefly. Scoop and Biscuit then make their way on through that and enter into what is the Dreamy Neighborhood, which is the hyper stylized, hyper idealized, almost like a weird limbo space where they continue to, to their senses, it's almost, they can't even necessarily determine whether or not they are still in Scoop Universe at all in that kind of way. That they got teleported into the town, and this follow-up episode almost acts, these two kind of pairs, the town and Springa, or the town and the Dreamy Neighborhood, almost act as a weird like midway, like intermissional series or sequence in the show. And we're going to find that they are kind of pulled back out of this little weird dream sequence of sorts back into the very explicit Scoop Universe way and world and of that past. But like we've talked about before, a lot of the Scoop Universe episodes have kind of taken place in this like hyper past, this kind of high fantasy of sorts, conquistadors and like fantastic water creatures and underwater, just bizarre like monsters and behemoths and just these species that shouldn't even exist in the real world kind of today. And again, Scoop Universe is by no means in the real world today, but so much of the show takes place in 500 to 1,000 years ago in the sense of our kind of human construction of time. But now all of a sudden this town episode takes place in what could be 5 years from now in the future, like so completely separate in terms of time of the rest of Scoop Universe, whether or not it's just a function of there are worlds that are on these very different timelines or that have just developed completely differently and completely independently is unclear. And they kind of try to find that out and scour around and look for that. But if the town was a hyper modern, today, 22nd century place, Springa, or the Dreamy Neighborhood, is like our childhood. You watching this show, you watching this episode and hearing about Scoop Universe and the people that will be kind of sitting in their chairs and on their couches watching Scoop Universe, the Dreamy Neighborhood is that somehow the nostalgia that isn't the deep past like the rest of the show. It's going to be this dream space, this limbo space of what kind of everyone living at all times has attempted to reclaim and attempted to revisit and just re-exist and re-experience, which is the kind of hazy perfection of youth. And in this way, Scoop and Biscuit stumble upon what would look like kind of just like a northeastern codename Kids Next Door is the kind of elusive style guide for this part of this episode, at least, but of just where like kids have power and kids rule. It's not like a Lord of the Flies kind of scenario, but Scoop and Biscuit walk into a space where like the trees are so much bigger than they seem like they should be. And there are these big houses, again, bigger as if they're in a kid's perspective, like on the ground looking up, but they're not. They feel like they're the same size. And again, there is this like tinge, this haze, this fog of like glistening, hazy, dreamy air that is just indescribable, but just kind of still there, as if like they have teleported back into their youth that is not really perfectly capturable by what would be an otherwise youthful mind. And they run into these gang of kids, and I use gang loosely because it is just kind of, it's a group of friends. It's a group of kids that live in the Dreamy Neighborhood. They are in the suburbs, the kind of the super rural sections of what is kind of connected to the town. They don't necessarily identify themselves as part of the town, and there can be some connections and relationships between Shirley, the young black girl that we see in the town itself, and some of these kids. But Scoop and Biscuit kind of start to talk with them and be like, where are we? Like, what's going on here? And this is the episode where, like, I've kind of said, like, every episode, more or less, and kind of in this midnight gospel-y way, is about people having, like, a platform or speaking for a community or speaking for just a way of perceiving the universe. And these kids are now, if Shirley's perspective in the town was one of like fear and violence and of a forced position in the rat race and in the maze, these kids are kind of the dreamy perspective of that instead, the fantastic element of that instead, where they are seeing the world through that idealized way, that blissful ignorance of sorts, but again, that kind of blissful intelligence of sorts, where kids see things with a very particular perspective that even Scoop and Biscuit don't necessarily understand. But something that sets Scoop and Biscuit apart is that they do understand better than the adults do in that way, that there is something magical and powerful and eternally youthful about Scoop and Biscuit that the kids can kind of connect to and begin to talk to them about. And in terms of what it's like to have parents or not have parents, or to be in the world where you kind of don't have these responsibilities, but there are these necessary responsibilities of what it is to be a kid and what it is to be exploring and what it is to kind of go without guidance or to go with too much guidance. And there is a big section of essentially the first half of the episode revolving around these kids and Scoop and Biscuit making their way. At least in the moment, you could kind of argue that the first quarter of the episode, probably more like the first fifth of the episode, is Scoop and Biscuit making their way through, like past the town, and they just see, they see Ariadne just kind of briefly and make their way into this dreamy neighborhood. They then stumble upon the kids, and the kids are essentially on a quest of their own to find Springa. and Springa will take up the last half of the episode. It turns out that Springa, and something after the kids have kind of monologued themselves and talked about, again, their perceptions of the universe, their place in the universe, what it means to be kind of like in this weird outside space, this weird liminal space. If one thing defines the dreamy neighborhood, it is liminal space. It is just between spaces. And in that same way, Scoop and Biscuit are here between episodes. They are kind of not exactly in the real track of Scoop Universe anymore. They kind of step into the modern world and get to speak with modern characters for just a moment before leaving again. But these kids are on a sort of mythical quest of their own. It turns out that there's another world in Scoop Universe that does cycle and orbit through and by. This world is called Springa, and we will find that Springa happens to be the birthplace of Biscuit. The kids know that there is kind of this forest world that is just outside of even their liminal space, just outside of their neighborhood. Just like how kind of a super rural, or non-urban, a super rural suburban neighborhood would have, there are these kind of idealized big forests and empty open spaces that have yet to be claimed by modernity in that way. Within that, where the kids go off and questing into and have their stories and kind of live their lives, they want to find this mythical place called Springa. And supposedly in this place, the animals speak to you, and the animals stand, and the animals have a life of their own. And the kids have heard stories of this passed down through generations of other kids, where there's kind of an interesting play between and about history like that, with like generations that stop after like 12 years. And in that kind of codename Kids Next Door way, these kids almost exist as if the life and death, like their lifespan is 12 years. Like the kids are kids and then they are not kids. And only in their kid form do they exist in the dreamy neighborhood. Are they allowed to exist, and are they potentially allowed to access Springa? And so in that same way where we see Scoop and Biscuit get kind of revealed as having qualities about themselves that are kid-like or can connect in this eternally youthful way, it turns out that Scoop and Biscuit might also have access to Springa, and the kids want to be able to use them or talk with them, or you get their help to access this world. Good night, Mako. Thanks for hanging out. And so Scoop and Biscuit, along with these kids, they're kind of their monologues end. And as a brief aside as well, I've thought of something that I think would be really cool and really interesting that we could apply back to almost every single monologue that in reality, Trip does a lot of in his Moat episode, and Under Quiero does a lot in his episodes way back in the day, on the ship when he is talking to Scoop. That there is kind of for there to be a narrative occurring before their hands and before their eyes, that like the character themselves is running through as if like they knock something over. They're talking, they're monologuing at Scoop. So Under Quiero, for example, we'll go back to the Conquistador ship. Under Quiero is monologuing to Scoop, but while he's monologuing and talking about like the A track, he is engaging with his world, and there is like a narrative that if you just ignored his words, you could watch him interfacing with the world and like seeing something fall, going to catch it, dropping and knocking something else over, and he picks that up and realizes that this is something else over here, and this goes here, and he starts like doing something while monologuing. I think this kind of like double dialogue is kind of really interesting and can be given to almost every single character that monologues. I think it'd be really cool to design that for every single one. But so the kids probably do that in their same way too, where they're probably walking and talking with Scoop and Biscuit through the dreamy neighborhood into the forest kind of around them, in a hunt, on a search for Springa, or this kind of supposed portal to Springa. It turns out again that the kids aren't even necessarily aware of the fact that there are these orbiting planets in this way, and so the myth, the legend that has been passed down from kid to kid is actually, because their lifespan is so short, in a way, their lifespan, because they don't die, but in the way that their existence in the dreamy neighborhood is so limited, it turns out that their understanding of this orbit around these planets is kind of stunted or incomplete. And so that just kind of explains their misunderstanding, or at least lack of understanding, of how to access Springa. It's not just like a magical portal. And again, there are these like, there are going to be these fantastic stories about what is in Springa that are all blown out of proportion, and that you can only get there by like doing some crazy quest, or like doing something really insane, or like bringing some crazy sacrifice, or doing something just including adults, or just to separate yourself from the adults, where you have to commit to your childhood in order to break into Springa. There are going to be these tales and stories like that Scoop and Biscuit kind of figure out the truth about. And it turns out that it is just about the orbiting of planets that comes through. And so Springa itself is on a little tiny forest planet that does happen to run its orbit through the dreamy neighborhood. The kids are realizing, like, this is coming up soon. Like, all the kind of childlike prophecies are coming right about now. Our signs and signals have come together, and now Scoop is here all of a sudden, like, in this almost prophetic way. And they find or see the Springa planet kind of like rolling in, and they try to kind of like leap on, and without the help of Trip. So we've seen in the pilot episode at least, and in potentially some other episodes as well, how Trip's technology helps allow Scoop to traverse these planets. It's not easy for any old character to just go from world to world. That's part of Scoop's superpower, of a sense, though it seems as if guided or helped by Trip, that he can make these passages. And so therefore this is the reason why he can be the sheriff of Scoop Universe and kind of go to each of these worlds and map it out, learn it, explore it, and then serve justice as best he can in this almost super adult way, where he's the only one with the access to all of this information, to all of these powers, and to kind of just all of these places. So somehow Scoop kind of plants and cements himself into simultaneously hyper adult and hyper childlike, in yet another kind of escape from a regular or normative or expected character, especially one that is found in Scoop Universe. So it turns out that they eventually kind of make the jump. They make the leap into Springa. And I think the probably maybe not melancholic, but the kind of sad reality that gets placed into the episode is that, like, none of the kids, or maybe only like one of the kids, gets to actually make it over into Springa. That's probably what we'll end up doing, is that, like, I would love, so that type of like denial, or that sad denial, is something I think just makes for very kind of powerful just storytelling and television, etc. But we build up all this stuff with the kids being so jacked, so excited to potentially finally be able to make it into Springa, but that it turns out that only one kid at a time can make it. And to be the one that kind of eventually comes back and tells the tales of it, spins the stories, passes down the legends, essentially. But when that kid enters into Springa, do they ever make it back in time while they are still a kid? Is that how the stories get passed down from adults that were kids that could make it into Springa but lost in some kind of memory fugue the realities of the dreamy neighborhood, the exact details of it? Do they lose the details of the fact that the animals talk and that they have a life of their own? Those kind of mysteries will certainly get worked into the episode and dramas. But so absolutely some of the kids will kind of be denied entrance to Springa, and that's going to be a heartbreaking scene. But Scoop and Biscuit also make it through with one of the kids that probably is in this group at the dreamy neighborhood. And they find out that it is absolutely again, the colors change, the animation style changes, and it is this animal utopia planet of sorts. But it's not really a planet. It's, again, like a really, really tiny little world that is just essentially just a forest with all these different characters that are animals, no humans, just this boy that probably comes over with Scoop and Biscuit into Springa. And to just kind of go and read some of the characters are from this. The childhood nostalgia episodes is the other like name for this double parted episode, where including the town. So with Shirley, like the childhood nostalgia episodes is this kind of like, in the town, it's almost the villainous childhood nostalgia, where they are beneath the heel and boot of power of their world, of their town, of their maze, of their otherness in that way, and almost like the sordid story there. And then we see the second childhood nostalgia is of that dreamy neighborhood, of the suburban half compared to the urban half. But some of the characters here just written into this, so from the Pitch Bible, like I said, this turns out to be the kind of twist in there, not really necessarily a twist, but a reveal, is that this is where Biscuit was born. Biscuit actually was, in his lore, we understand it that he was orphaned and found himself kind of on the doorstep of Pompola back in Orta. It turns out that Scoop is related to his orphanage and his passage over to Pompola. But this is where he grew up. I mean, it's no coincidence that, again, like the talking, speaking, two-legged animal in that sense is from this place. We kind of finally see where he's from. And he gets a little episode of his own, though there isn't too much in there. And like his parents, do we do some absolutely tear-wrenching, gut, heartstring-pulling sequences with Biscuit and like meeting his parents again? Probably. Like, it's just too good to pass up in that way. Or that his parents are kind of the not like Leela from Futurama in that kind of way, where it's like his parents don't really look like her or look like him, or that they aren't also dogs, or that the laws of nature in that way kind of get mixed and mashed, and you can have non-dog parents have a dog kid, and those kind of weird twists. And in this way as well, we see Springa as an extension of the evolutionary ecosystem episode of the chess maze, where we talked a lot about like PvP and what it means to be like in competition, etc. And there is a sense of competition in this episode as well, but between animals and in this kind of hunter-gatherer, forager ecosystem way. How much of the episode is dedicated to Springa, whether or not it's the last 20 minutes or it's the last only like 10 or 15 is unclear. So how much we can really squeeze in this episode, I'm not sure. But one of my favorite parts about Scoop Universe is honestly the fact that every single episode can be spun off into either an entire series on its own, which from a pitching and marketing perspective is something that I'm absolutely going to kind of harp on, is that absolutely you could write an entire show just based off of the world of every single one of the episodes. Or if we just stayed there, if only we stayed there, we could have seen another whole universe. That's essentially at the core of Scoop Universe, is that Scoop and Biscuit are moving. They are going. They are, whether by their own accord or by searching for requests, again, they are kind of still searching for the marbles from Under Kiero's message that he once had these artifacts that revealed something in a direction within the universe. It acted like this guiding compass light, but he lost them. They were stolen from him. How does Biscuit and Scoop find those? How do they find those? They are kind of on this search still. It turns out that we see Trip has stolen them, and Biscuit and Scoop are just continuing to move through Scoop Universe. There are things that demand their attention, demand their help, demand their kind of map exploration. And so it's a weird tragedy that is kind of laced and lined throughout every Scoop Universe episode, is that if only they could have stayed, and something by the end of every time kind of forces them to keep going. Nevertheless, some of the other characters that we find that are named in this Springa world are the likes of Chicken Thunky, a weird little, again, like peep chicken character. Ipschwitz Licksticky, who is the squirrel like sheriff of a sort that exists in Springa, like a little like semi-fake sheriff that it turns out is almost maybe taken over the reign of what Biscuit could have been there. But we see that there's another sheriffy character, potentially Ipschwitz Lipsticky, are working together with Stoop Doofus, who is a like caricature of an animal form of Scoop, except the far kind of degenerate, useless failure version of a sort. But all these different characters are kind of engaging with each other, where each of them think that they are the alpha, or understand that they are the beta. And that's what I was talking about, is that this episode is kind of the animal version of the chess episode, where different characters believe themselves to be in the power position, believe themselves to be a shark, or understand that their opponent, their enemy, who they see is the fish. And this just alignment and perception of who is winning, who should be seen as the predator and who should be seen as the prey, how that plays out through, again, PvP, throughout competition, throughout evolution. This is the animal form of it. And so each of these characters, almost like in a slapsticky kind of memey way, the lighthearted, the kind of nostalgic or cutesy way, play out this same role, the same kind of like role play of, no, like I am the leader, no, like I am the leader. And it is fighting over a store of berries, or for the right to kind of sleep in the hole that's in this tree for the night kind of thing. And so it again spins off into this like cutesy liminal space episode. But we see connected to it, there is Redwall is another kind of like classic connection that we can kind of, you can think of in terms of not necessarily animation in the same way, but just of the way the characters are playing out, but a slightly less serious Redwall. But there is another place that Scoop and Biscuit go to where they see these characters. There's almost like a tavern called Two Bears Kills that is the animal bar of sorts, where they interact with, like how in the underwater episode, in the 10,000 Legs Under the Sea episode, we see that there's like an arcade bar series and sequence there. I have a kind of fond soft spot that shows up in some of my other writings and stories of like the bar space, not necessarily a bar, but closer to like the tavern space, that kind of high fantasy tavern where it is the wooden walled, diverse character filled, unique story space and kind of like break point, stopping point, midway point for the traveling character, where they find other characters like themselves, brand new characters that have been on a journey for 10 times as long as you, or have just arrived there with you the same way, or are always there. I love this like very hyper tight, dynamic, concentrated space. And we see a kind of a memed version of this here in Springa. There's another character called, what is it? She's not in here right now. I think it's Stofy finally makes her appearance as kind of like the semi-queen of the place, that Scoop and Biscuit talk to, and they kind of learn some things about Springa. They learn about just the connections between the animals, and they learn the backstory of Biscuit. They kind of hail Biscuit's return, potentially in some cases, like that kind of long lost king. But Biscuit must eventually leave this episode, as we see towards the end of it, after just kind of having this brief aside where they finally get to bring one of the kids from the dreamy neighborhood into Springa to continue that mythology. They learn the mythology of Biscuit. They just see some of these cute characters. I'm sure there's like, again, a mini conflict of sorts will play out between some of the characters thinking that they are alpha or that they are beta or not, and getting it wrong or getting it right, and that Scoop must kind of mediate between these. But this episode absolutely is the kind of finale of the transition episode, the finale of the kind of liminal space episode, where the kids are on the edge of youth and kind of anti-youth in that way. They're just in this freaky little space where they understand, I have it written down here that almost like literally in this kind of child psychology philosophy style way, that there is a term essentially called the end of youth, where it is more or less situated around like 6th grade-ish, where you have a perception of the universe now, and identity politics kind of start to become manifested and realized. In this manifestation and realization, they search and hunt for Springa. They finally break through into Springa, and the characters and the animals in Springa also have this kind of end of youthness to their animalhood, where they have this bubbling up of identity politics between animals. And we forget that, again, they essentially do in the real world, that they have a perception, understanding of what that animal is, what that creature is, who am I to them, who are they to me. But we just give them a voice, we give them 2 legs, we give them laughs, we give them clothes, and we watch Scoop and Biscuit kind of move throughout this space that is just an extension of a series of narratives that have been explored up until this point. So, really, this episode just ultimately ends with Biscuit being understood that like this was his place. There is likely that reuniting episode, that reuniting sequence with him and the family that he left so soon, spun away off into Scoop Universe to find himself down at Pompola's doorstep. And we will talk towards the end of all these episodes about some of the, again, twists or mysteries or loops that will be pulled in here, but it turns out that kind of Biscuit finds himself transported and teleported through a fundamental part of the universe to find himself on the other side, and that Scoop actually, as like a brief kind of spoiler of sorts, Scoop was there with Biscuit. This is kind of one of the semi-reveals that might occur in this episode, that Scoop was there with Biscuit when he made the transport over across seas, across oceans, across worlds, across skies to Pompola's doorstep. And because of Scoop being there with him, he made it safely. And though having no real memory of this travel, that is the foundation for his like subconsciously cemented understanding that Scoop is someone of massive importance to him, that he has this like love-like connection to Scoop in this man's best friend kind of way, but far transcending that because of Scoop and the powers that Scoop has, Biscuit made it successfully from one side of the world to the other when he should absolutely have died, been obliterated, incinerated along the passage. Scoop protects him, whether he chose to or not, but out of likely the kindness of his heart and of his own exploration and of his own potential kind of transport and passage throughout the universe. This is the foundation of their relationship and of their teamwork and communication and cooperation. And so we just learned a lot of things about Biscuit. We learned some things about Scoop. We realized something in this weirdly sinister way, that this Springa world is actually right at the border of one of the corners of Scoop universe. We haven't really talked about that much, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit here, because when and how it comes up is in these like weird little interspersed details. Most of Scoop universe, as I'm realizing as we go through it, is the story. It is absolutely a mystery, as I think everybody other than myself would experience when watching and going through the show. There, so many things are hidden. Like, the show itself is that twisting labyrinth. It is the labyrinth of labyrinths. It goes through corners and turns where you do not know what is around the corner, but you know that almost by definition, like, there is this weird quality about the labyrinth that it existed before you showed up. Like, it has been there. It has been carved out. It was carved out both on purpose and by someone somewhere. Who carved it? Why are we here? Who is the Minotaur that is at the end of it? And what happens on the way? And what do we miss by taking this left turn versus that right turn? And that you can never stop. Scoop and Biscuit are progressing through the labyrinth, the super labyrinth, without stopping, and realizing that along the way there are niches, there are ecosystems of people who have stopped. People who have not, of entire species, of entire narratives, who essentially set down roots within the labyrinth. I am just obsessed with the idea that there could be a labyrinth where it's not just like the empty god hero that is walking through the labyrinth by himself and there is nobody on the way until he meets the singular Minotaur at the end. Absolutely, there would be things that have grown and evolved in this labyrinth along the way. It would make it so much more exciting and so much more interesting and so much more dynamic, especially if other heroes have made this way before. They have left their seeds behind, and Scoop is just following down and interacting with all of these different fruits and plants and creatures that have sprouted up within the labyrinth itself. So, we learn all of these things along the way. And the episode essentially ends with a horn being sounded as they learn about this kind of spooky, like sinister, almost mysterious edge of the universe that is right on the other side of Springa. That this orbiting planet is one of the closest planets to this corner of the universe that played a role in Biscuit's transport and teleportation from one side to the other. We hear a horn blast essentially across Scoop universe. And it turns out that a call has rung out from the Olympus Cloud Castle Bank that the Sigma has been stolen. The Sigma is missing. Scoop and Biscuit must essentially respond to this like call for alarm, this ring for alarm. And Trip as well hears this call and must respond to it as well, because it turns out that he is, as we kind of talked about briefly before, Trip has an investment in the Cloud Castle Bank. He had kind of performed the science on the ASMR clouds to just the basic white building block clouds of the ASMR world, not the colored ones. Trip performed the science that allowed them to create building blocks, little like bricks, out of this cloud stuff that they then built sections of the Cloud Castle Bank in. Through this indebtment, Trip set up a spot to send off the artifacts that he had stolen and hides down deep in the Cloud Castle Bank, kind of this mysterious artifact of his. It turns out this alarm goes missing, or this alarm goes blaring across Scoop Universe. The Sigma has been stolen. The artifact that is deep within the Cloud Castle Bank has gone missing, and the people there, the king there, the rulers of the Cloud Castle Bank, they need it back. A quest has gone up on the kind of storyboard for the people, and Scoop, as the sheriff of the universe, is kind of asked or begged for his assistance in this theft. Scoop has no idea kind of what was there, how it was stolen. It turns out that Trip does, and they now go and must leave Springa, and through Trip's kind of technology, allow them to transport essentially back off of the world of Springa and over towards the Olympus Cloud Castle Bank itself, which is going to be a 2-part episode. One of the longest, the longest sequence really, where we take place on one planet, one world alone, and is essentially the Hercules episode or the Olympus episode, the very truly Grecian episode that has a lot of really cool stuff in it and some of my favorite visuals and places, and is really an extra level of explaining and exploring the real storyline of Scoop Universe, which involves Trip stealing the marbles from under Kiero, having them stolen, or placing them, going under attack essentially by Pompola. We see in a flashback episode that Trip steals the marbles from under Kiero, begins to perform some tests and experiments on them because he knows that there is something powerful here. He knows that this is a way to solve some key critical mystery about the universe and why things are beginning to slip away. Pompola's kind of Delta Force team breaks into his castle lab. Triphead then must kind of send his marbles away. And it turns out that there is an artifact missing from the Cloud Castle Bank now that Trip coincidentally, conveniently has a connection to. He runs there to go find if his marbles have been, or his artifacts have been stolen. Scoop must go there as well now. And we see kind of one of the major playing outs of this relationship between Trip and Scoop playing out here in this very Herculean space that we're going to see soon. So that is essentially the blaring horn that cuts short the understanding that there is an edge of the universe right here on the other side of Springa. Scoop and Biscuit leave behind the child that had been taken or kind of went with them in safe passage from the dreamy neighborhood over to Springa, and kind of we leave that narrative floating behind, and they begin their travel over to the Olympian space. The episode ends there, and as we've been talking about, every set of these episodes kind of goes 1, 2 in order in real chronology, and then a flashback episode. So we just had the town. Now we had Springa, or the dreamy neighborhoods. So the following episode, the one that we're going to be talking about on Thursday, is a flashback episode. So we're not going to get to the Olympus Cloud Castle Bank just yet, but we go flashback. We're going to learn some more about Trip. We're going to learn some more about how he got his hands on the felt, which is that other connective artifact that is, when combined with the marbles, Trip understands, or must seek to understand, their connection in deciphering and discovering some of the true details about the history and origin of Scoop Universe. So that's going to come in a little while. So on Thursday is going to be talking about the next flashback acronymed episode, except this acronymed episode is called Love Lang. It's a double acronym episode in that way. featuring 2 characters like a lot of our flashback episodes are going to, but we're going to be seeing one of our Kelpie characters returning that we saw in the underwater episode in 10,000 Legs Under the Sea. They are going to be playing a role, and we see Indiana Bones, who is going to also be playing a role. Together, they are going to be kind of doing a dungeon dive, a ziggurat dive, as they go down into Pampala's ziggurat world to go hunting artifacts, as Inji only knows how to do. That's essentially the breakdown for these last episodes that we just talked about, the ones that are coming up. A lot of interesting things are essentially now starting to tie together. This episode right now actually marks the 9th episode. So if we count the pilot as episode 0, we have 10,000 Legs Under the Sea, which is episode 1, where Scoop and Biscuit return underwater. They run into Toasty and the underwater barcade, and then eventually find the Kelpie people. They kind of transfer over from those into the Kelpie people, where they find the Jade Flower, which is this gigantic Kraken Leviathan that is kind of settled on a series of petrified wood that seems to have sunk into the bottom of the ocean below Pampala's planet. Trip has been harvesting some of this enchanted wood, and Scoop and Biscuit just learn about both just the massive scale and size of the world, as well as just some of these details that, again, they can't really hang out at. They get summoned away, because in the second episode, they go up, meet Under Kiero, have the monologues about the marbles being stolen. Before long, a planet comes rolling in and scoops up a humongous section of water off of the ocean planet, scooping up Biscuit and Scoop and Under Kiero in their ship, where it washes them away into the chess planet. We see a flashback episode talking about Trip. The chess episode follows that. Scoop and Biscuit find themselves suddenly, first actually, before they get to the chess episode, they have to break through the water halls, where water is plummeting down through the chess blocks in the chess world, making a maze of falling water that shifts and moves, and there's a people that has learned to exist within the splashes of these waters, make their way through the water halls, up into the chess world, where they run through the maze, learn more things about PvP, about ecosystems and niches and competition within those characters who choose to remain seated within the labyrinth, who do not run the rat race to its end, but run it just simply through cycles within the maze itself. They get stuck within the cat ASMR villains, the nighttime sphinx's mirage trap, where it attempts to steal actual sounds from their vocabulary permanently forever. But they break the code, bust out in a stupor into the town, where they then run through that. There's another flashback episode to the ASMR where we actually see the home world of that nighttime sphinx, and a series of hopeful ASMR vocalists come and play the characters in that episode. It should be wicked awesome. We see surrealism play itself out very explicitly in Man Ray's La Fortune. And Scoop and Biscuit then leave this fugue after breaking through the nighttime sphinx's ASMR drowsy kind of spell into modernity, into this like weird liminal space episode, into this weird kind of transitional episode where they go into a 21st century city, where we see talk about blackness, otherness, whiteness, richness, poorness, and illusion and perception in that way, and the kind of abuse of power. They then spin into Springa here, where they meet the youthful, dreamy kids like that are in their own semi-world, in their own liminal space, searching, yearning for a place of animals before essentially leveling up into adulthood, where they do find them. We see Biscuit's hometown, home world, and suddenly something has been stolen from the Cloud Castle Bank. We are jolted awake after learning some mysteries about the edge of the universe, and now this is where we find ourselves, stopped for the moment. Scoop and Biscuit are leaving. The audience will take a right-hand turn and go into a flashback episode featuring our Kelpie from underwater at the foot of that Jade Flower, and an Indiana Jones variant where they essentially attempt to overcome the love language, their disparate love languages, in a quest for an artifact at the bottom of a ziggurat, where we meet yet another Sphinx-like creature. So that's coming up. That's all that's come. Thank you guys for hanging out. This will go up at some point. Search it on YouTube. Hopefully this copyright will go through and I will be able to truly officially stamp and watermark Scoop Universe forever. But we continue on. I will see you guys on Thursday.